It was December 6th, 1929. Somewhere deep inside Moscow, a government official signed a document known as Decree Number 118. On paper, it looked straightforward, almost mundane. Bell ringing across the entire Soviet Union was now forbidden. Every bell, from every church, every cathedral, every monastery, was to be taken down and melted. The explanation? Industrialization. They needed the bronze. But what they actually did went far beyond resource collection. In a single move, they silenced 1 million voices and erased the people who knew how to make those voices sing. I didn't stumble onto this decree while looking for anything political. I was researching something completely different. I wanted to understand why old buildings feel different. Why stepping into a cathedral instantly changes the way you experience sound. Why certain government buildings from the 1700s and 1800s seem to carry a kind of resonance that modern structures just don't have. That trail led me to acoustics. Acoustics led me to bells. And bells led me straight to Decree 118. From there, everything started to unravel. Before 1917, more than 1 million bronze bells rang across the Russian Empire. They weren't just scattered randomly. They were everywhere. Churches, monasteries, civic buildings. But these weren't simple instruments. Russian bells were engineered to specific frequencies, crafted by specialists whose families had passed down their methods for generations. There were over 20 major bell foundries operating across the country, each with its own techniques, its own formulas, its own acoustic signature. This wasn't just metal work, it was knowledge. Precise, inherited, refined knowledge. And by the early 1930s, every single one of those bells was gone. Silenced, melted, erased. The foundries were shut down, the craftsmen disappeared, and something even stranger happened. The knowledge itself vanished. When Russia tried to bring back bell making after the Soviet Union collapsed, they couldn't just pick up where they left off. They had to start over. Techniques that had once been common knowledge, only a few decades earlier, were completely lost. The official explanation is simple. The knowledge wasn't written down. It was passed orally, from master to apprentice. When that chain broke, the information disappeared. But here's the problem. That chain didn't break naturally. It was cut. The bell makers didn't slowly fade away, surrounded by students who failed to learn. They were removed, deliberately, within a very specific window of time. So I started asking a different question. What else disappeared during that same period? Because the bells weren't the whole story. They were just the voice. The real question is, who knew how to use them? Who understood the timing, the sequences, the patterns that gave those sounds meaning? The answer was the clergy, and the clergy were being eliminated at a rate that's hard to even comprehend. In 1917, there were around 200,000 Orthodox clergy across the Russian Empire. By 1941, only a few thousand remained. That's not decline, that's erasure. Between 1927 and 1940, the number of Orthodox churches dropped from over 29,000 to fewer than 500. Not closed, not repurposed, destroyed. Buildings torn down, repurposed into something unrecognizable. The people inside them, removed, exiled, or simply gone. In 1937, the last monks connected to the Danilov Monastery were lined up and erased from history. Their bells had already been sold off to Harvard University 7 years earlier. The instruments survived. The people who understood them did not. Now, maybe you're thinking, this was just anti-religious persecution. The Soviet government hated the church. They wanted to eliminate religion from society. And yes, that's part of it. But it doesn't explain the precision. They didn't just shut down churches. They targeted specific individuals, people who carried knowledge, people who understood rituals, timing, systems. They didn't just melt bells. They made sure no one remained who knew how to tune them. They didn't just reject tradition. They erased anyone who could explain what those traditions actually meant. And here's where things start to get uncomfortable. Because this wasn't only happening in the Soviet Union. Different country, different method, different excuse. Same result. January 10th, 1921. Washington, D.C. In the basement of the Commerce Department building, a watchman noticed smoke creeping through the pipes. By the time firefighters arrived, the damage was already spreading. When the fire was finally put out, they realized something devastating. Most of the 1890 United States Census had been destroyed. About 25% of it burned completely. Another 50% was damaged beyond use, soaked with water, blackened by smoke, weakened by fire. But here's the part that doesn't sit right with me. The surviving records weren't preserved. They weren't restored. They weren't treated like the historical treasure they were. They were boxed up, moved to a warehouse, and left there for 12 years, exposed to moisture, mold, decay, just left to rot. And then, in 1933, Congress quietly approved the destruction of whatever remained. Out of nearly 63 million people recorded in that census, only about 6,000 names exist today. That's not just loss, that's surgical. The 1890 census wasn't just another data collection. It captured America at a turning point. Mass immigration, westward expansion, the closing of the frontier. It documented who people were, where they came from, what they owned, and it existed in only one place. Unlike previous censuses, there were no backup copies stored locally, no duplicates in state archives. Everything was centralized in Washington. So when it burned, there was nothing left to fall back on. The official investigation never found a cause. Maybe it was a cigarette, maybe faulty wiring, maybe something else entirely. But no one seemed particularly interested in finding out. A 20-year gap was burned straight into American history, and the country just moved on. Like losing the records of 63 million people was nothing more than an unfortunate accident. The more I looked into it, the harder it became to ignore the pattern forming beneath the surface. Because when you really think about what was lost in that fire, it wasn't just numbers on paper. The 1890 census was different from everything that came before it. For the first time, each household had its own detailed form. It didn't just count people, it described them. Questions about home ownership, immigration status, naturalization. Whether they could speak English. It captured a country in transition. The exact moment America was shifting from a frontier nation into an industrial power. And all of that, every detail, every identity, every record of 63 million lives was first reduced to ash, and then deliberately destroyed years later, when there was still a chance to preserve what remained. So you have to ask yourself, who benefits from a gap like that? Who needed those 20 years between 1880 and 1900 to disappear from the record? Because once I started asking that question, I began seeing the same pattern everywhere. Different countries, different systems, different explanations. But always the same outcome. The removal of people who knew things, the destruction of records that proved things, the disappearance of knowledge that explained things. Take 1937, for example. The same year, the last monks from Danilov Monastery vanished. Two Armenian architects, Gavril Koch and Michael Mizmanian, were arrested and sent to the polar regions of Russia. Officially, they were charged with nationalism, supporting the wrong political faction. But if you read between the lines, The real issue becomes clearer. They were architects studying the wrong buildings. They were asking questions about why certain structures were designed the way they were, noticing inconsistencies between official construction records and what physically existed. In other words, they were looking too closely. And they weren't the only ones. There was a building in Moscow known as the House on the Embankment. During this same period, over 800 of its residents were taken away. More than 300 of them never returned. Many of those residents were engineers, architects, officials who worked with historical records and old structures, people who might have started connecting dots, people who might have asked questions that weren't supposed to be asked. And then there's something even harder to ignore: the languages. This is the part that genuinely unsettles me, because it didn't happen in secret. It happened right out in the open. And somehow, no one connected it to everything else. Throughout the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, languages weren't slowly evolving or fading over centuries the way they normally do. They were disappearing, fast. Entire languages dying out within a single generation. In 1960, a man named Ishi died in California. He was the last known member of the Yahi people, the final speaker of his language. When he died, everything his culture knew, their understanding of the land, the plants, the structures their ancestors built, disappeared with him. In 1930, Ascension Solano Cervantes passed away. With her, the Mutan language vanished. In 1934, Benjamin Paul died, and the Shitimacha language went silent. That same year, linguists made their final recordings of the Tequelma language. Only 2 elderly speakers remained, and even they struggled to remember the words. In 1939, the last speaker of the Rumsen language died in Monterey. In 1940, Delphine Duclos passed, and with her, another voice was lost forever. By 1935, most of the Great Andes language family had gone extinct. 10 distinct languages, gone in less than a generation. Each one carried words, concepts, entire ways of understanding the world that no longer exist anywhere on Earth. The standard explanation is easy. These were indigenous languages, pushed aside by dominant ones: English, Russian, Spanish, French. Their speakers assimilated. Their children adopted new vocabularies, natural linguistic evolution. But when you look closer, something doesn't add up. It wasn't random languages disappearing. It was place-based languages. Languages tied to specific landscapes, specific structures, specific regions. Languages that contained words for ideas we don't even have equivalents for anymore. Another researcher digging into this came across references to terms like krasnot, the emotional quality of red; zonost, the singing property of metal; dukamna, loosely translated as the spirit of stone. These aren't just poetic descriptions, they're technical language. Operational vocabulary for concepts we've lost the ability to even think about, because we no longer have the words. And once you start lining all of this up on a timeline, it becomes impossible to ignore. 1918, bell ringing banned across Russia. 1921, the 1890 census burns. 1922, gold and silver confiscated from Russian churches. 1929, Decree 118 orders all bells melted. 1930, the Mutan language disappears. 1933, Congress authorizes destruction of the remaining census records. The same year, the Soviet Union sets quotas for collecting bell bronze. 1934, Kitimacha language extinct. 1935, most Great Andes languages gone. 1937, the Danilov monks vanish. Architects are arrested. The house on the embankment begins to empty. 1939, the Rumsen language dies. 1940, 98% of Russian Orthodox churches are gone. 1948 and 1949. Major purges sweep through the Soviet Academy of Architecture. And then, 1952. According to accounts that surfaced much later, the last person who understood how all of this connected died in a city called Almaty. In his final hours, he reportedly told his grandson things he had been forbidden to speak about for 60 years. And then, that knowledge was gone too. I don't think these are coincidences. I don't think these are isolated tragedies that just happened to fall near each other on a calendar. I think this is a pattern. Different governments, different continents, different methods, but the same target. The bell founders who understood frequency, the clergy who knew the sequences, the architects who understood proportion, the census records that proved identity, the languages that carried meaning, all of it removed, all of it within roughly the same 40-year window. And the precision of it, the way it targets not just objects, but the people who understood those objects, it suggests something more than chaos. It suggests intention, because here's the part that stays with me. The buildings are still here. That's what makes all of this so unsettling. Whatever knowledge was once embedded in those structures, whatever purpose those proportions served, whatever function those bells were meant to carry out, the physical systems are still standing. Walk into a government building from the 1800s. Listen. Notice how sound behaves differently, how it travels, how it lingers. Look at the scale of the doorways, the height of the ceilings, the spacing of the staircases. Ask yourself why they were built that way. Why ceilings rise far higher than necessary. Why staircases feel designed for longer strides than modern bodies take. Why entire spaces seem tuned, not just constructed. The buildings remember something, even if we don't. They're still configured for operations we no longer understand, maintained by people who preserve them, without knowing what they were originally meant to do. And that leads to a question I can't shake. What if the buildings aren't broken? What if they're just waiting? The frequencies could still resonate if someone knew which notes to play. The proportions could still function if someone understood what they were designed for. The system is still there, but the operators are gone. The bell founders who could tune the instruments, the clergy who knew the sequences, the architects who could read the designs properly, the speakers who held the language to describe it all. One by one, between 1917 and 1952, they were removed, not gradually, not accidentally, but in a way that feels targeted. By 1920, no one knew how to tune the bells anymore. By 1934, the ceremonial knowledge had disappeared. By 1937, the ability to interpret architectural proportions was gone. By 1940, the languages that carried key concepts were extinct. And by 1952, the last person who could connect all the pieces took that understanding with him. This wasn't forgetfulness. It wasn't progress leaving old ideas behind. Knowledge didn't fade. It was eliminated. The people who carried it, gone. The records that preserved it, destroyed. The words that explained it, allowed to die. And now we're left standing inside structures we don't fully understand, surrounded by architecture that feels intentional, but whose purpose we can't quite grasp, haunted by proportions that suggest functions we can't even imagine anymore. I've tried, really tried, to find another explanation. Maybe this was all just coincidence. Maybe it really was religious persecution in Russia, mixed with bureaucratic failure in America, combined with natural linguistic decline across the world. Maybe I'm just connecting dots that aren't actually connected. That's what the rational part of my mind keeps telling me. But then I go back to the timeline. I look at what disappeared and when. I look at how specific the targets were. Not just objects, not just buildings. People. People who understood those things. And the coincidence explanation starts to fall apart. There are too many overlaps, too many threads crossing the same narrow window of time. Too many examples across too many cultures, all pointing in the same direction. The pattern repeats, over and over again. And the evidence is still standing all around us, in the buildings, in the spaces, in the way sound behaves where it shouldn't. But the people who could explain it, they've been gone for nearly a century. Not lost, not forgotten, removed. And the question that keeps coming back, the one I can't seem to answer, is this. If someone wanted to erase how the old world actually worked, wouldn't it look exactly like this? A coordinated effort, spanning decades, to eliminate every person who understood, every record that proved, every word that described, leaving the structures behind, leaving the physical systems intact, but removing the ability to use them. The shell remains, the operators are gone. And once you see that pattern, you can't unsee it. The buildings are still here, but the knowledge isn't.